What is history? We could start off by defining history as an investigation or an inquiry into what happened in the past. The word history comes from the Greek word historia, which means an investigation or an inquiry. While people have always held various beliefs about their past, they generally relied completely on traditional stories or traditional authorities or popular opinion or hearsay to form their views about the past. It is only starting from a certain point of time that we find investigation or inquiry into evidence surviving from the past being used as the very method to find out what happened in the past. The first person to do so, as far as we know, was an ancient Greek by the name of Herodotus, who is considered to be the father of history. He lived in the 5th century BCE. So, what makes investigation necessary if we want to find out what happened in the past? Well, to start with, we couldn't have had direct experience of events that happened before we were born. I was born in 1980, so there is no way I could have seen Mahatma Gandhi being assassinated. In fact, we haven't had direct experience even of most events that happened after we were born, because almost all of them would have happened in some different place. For example, I was not personally present in New York on September 11th, 2001, when two planes crashed into the Twin Towers. None of us has direct experience of events that happened centuries ago or thousands of years ago. We also don't have any video recordings of those events. So, how do we know what happened in those times? We have to rely on some evidence from the past that still survives in order to find out what happened. That evidence could include the verbal testimonies of people who lived in the past, which could have been passed down in the form of texts. That is one kind of evidence. The evidence could also include the remains of material objects like tools or weapons or coins or the remains of ancient buildings. Reconstructing the past based on these kinds of evidences is a bit like the investigation done by a detective who's trying to unravel the truth behind a particular event, say a murder or some other crime. The detective himself or herself might not have been present as an eyewitness to the crime. In fact, there may be no neutral eyewitnesses to the event at all. Different witnesses connected directly or indirectly to the event in question might even contradict one another. So the detective needs to figure out whether the testimonies of different witnesses are accurate or whether they are merely self-serving or biased accounts. He also needs to combine the evidence from people's verbal testimonies with other kinds of material evidence from the crime scene, like DNA analysis of blood stains or hair samples or fingerprints and so on, to infer or reconstruct what probably happened. In the same way, a person who investigates what happened in the past, whom we shall call a historian, has to assess all this evidence and often sort through conflicting testimonies of different people from the past, because the same event could have been interpreted differently by different people in that time, and self-serving biases could easily creep into any testimony. So, verbal testimony could be biased. The historian cannot just concoct a pleasant story that he wishes to be true. He cannot arbitrarily favor the testimonies of certain people and reject the testimonies of others who disagree with them. He has to investigate. He has to sort through all the evidence to come as close as possible, as close as possible to a true picture of what really happened. He may never be able to arrive at a complete picture or an exact picture of what happened because the evidence he gathers could be incomplete or it could have more than one interpretation. So ultimately, whatever narrative the historian constructs at the end based on the evidence will obviously be constrained by the evidence and not just be a fictional account, but it will still have some uncertainties in it because it's going to be shaped by how the historian interprets all this evidence. The degree of uncertainty might be less for certain questions and might be more for others, but in general, you can expect that for many questions, there might still be disagreements and debates about what really happened. So, both these forms of evidence need to be interpreted. So, what the historian reconstructs is not something that he concocts out of thin air. It is constrained by the evidence, but at the same time, his own interpretation of the evidence does go into shaping the narrative that he comes up with. Now, if we go back to the definition of history as an investigation or an inquiry into what happened in the past, there's one point that needs to be made explicit here. History is concerned with an investigation or inquiry into the past, but it is concerned only with what happened in the past in the world of humans, in the lives of humans, in the experiences of humans. History is not concerned about how wild animals or wild plants lived in the past. It is concerned about what was going on in human society. So, in this sense, history is humanistic. History also doesn't deal with the activity of God or gods or supernatural beings of any kind, although it certainly does deal with human beliefs about God's activities. It certainly does deal with religion, but it deals only with what happened in human society, human actions, human experiences. Now, some of you might legitimately point out that in many of the religious traditions, we find that supernatural beings, whether gods or angels or other kinds of supernatural beings play an important role in human society, even if they inhabit some superhuman realm. In some texts like the Mahabharata, we find that various gods are described as incarnating on the earth as human beings to fulfill some divine mission. In some texts, not just the Mahabharata, but also the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, God might even cause certain miraculous events to happen on the earth, again in human society. So, does that fall within the scope of history? Well, history cannot deal with the factual authenticity of such supernatural accounts. Even if such events did happen in human society, the historian has no special access to them. He can only deal with the evidence that is available to him today. And as a historian, he can neither affirm nor deny such supernatural interventions based on the evidence like older texts that have those miraculous accounts, because frankly it's difficult to say conclusively whether all the miraculous accounts commonly found in older texts from cultures around the world, whether they actually happened or whether they were even meant to be taken literally by the original authors, or whether at least some of them were embellished accounts written by pious human followers in that time. This doesn't mean that history is anti-religion just because the historian cannot validate as a historian the miraculous accounts in the older religious texts. Just as the scientist is constrained to appeal to natural laws for all the phenomena that he studies, the historian is also inclined to appeal to humanistic ideas, to human nature in the course of his investigations into the past. There are certainly tensions between the views of many historians and many religious people, just as there are also tensions between the views of scientists and many religious people. But just as being a scientist does not necessarily imply that one cannot be religious, being a historian also doesn't imply that one cannot be religious. You can be a scientist and also be religious, and similarly, you can also be religious while being a historian. Now, some common questions that are investigated by historians are: what was life in general like in the past in different cultures around the world? What did people wear? What did they eat? What beliefs did they have about the universe or about God or about life after death? How was society organized? When and why did wars happen? Who won those wars? Who were the kings or queens who ruled different regions? And when did they live? What were their achievements? What was life like for the common people? How and why did things change? Politically, economically, socially? There are innumerable questions that one can think of and try to investigate about the past, and different historians might be interested in different specific questions. These are just a few simple examples of questions.